Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War News. No, it's not. It's the Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you the extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into, to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Rather than watch Karate Kid, the remake, for the 19th time, I thought I would excuse myself to do a video and discuss a couple of topics that are topically pertinent and a few that are I guess a few days old. Some of these threads are a few days old, but worth looking into. So this one from Mick Ryan, who's the retired Australian general I've referred to a lot previously, is talking about the attack on Crimea last night. Ukraine reinforces that Crimea is still on the agenda and that they retain an objective of making the presence of the Russian military there untenable. But this is part of a wider adaptive strategic strike program. This is also another illustration of the sophisticated collection, analysis, planning and execution capabilities of Ukraine's evolving strategic strike system, which uses both Western and indigenous missiles and drones. The Crimea strike campaign, along with the degradation of Russian oil refining capacity, appear to remain the two highest priorities for the maturing Ukrainian strategic strike complex. For an indication of some of the recon and strike elements of the complex, see the recent Covert Shores summary of Ukrainian drones. These are some of the drones that have been developed indigenously by their own R&D and military industrial complex and whatnot. You've got the Beaver drones that were used quite widely to attack into Moscow and St. Petersburg some time ago, but we're now seeing more of these Lyutis. They have the twin tail and propeller at the back. There's some more footage just come out of the refinery that was hit. Was it last night before? As well, using these drones. You've got the old Tu-143. These were old from the 1970s, I think. You can see by the size of them, that have been rejigged and worked on. There are all sorts of drones basically being used. Some of them quite cheap and cheerful. And in fact, there's a tweet that I was looking at today that was talking about how a really cheap drone that the Russians took the mickey out of by saying, and I think it was shot down, I don't know, near a refinery or something, like, look at this drone put together with sticks and tape or something like that. And of course, the Ukrainians get the last laugh there because, yeah, you've just spent how much shooting that drone down? And it's just put together with sticks and tape. And you've just spent, $500,000 firing it down with a missile. And that's exactly the same rationale behind the effectiveness of the Shahed drones that the Russians have used, which is the Ukrainians are having to expend hugely costly missiles to shoot them down, when actually the Shaheds don't cost that much. Although, interestingly, we found out more recently in our report on this that the Shaheds cost a lot more than was initially thought. The Iranians charging the Russians a lot more than was as mentioned initially reported. But so many different types of drones doing so many different types of mission here. The Ukrainians, he continues, must constantly adapt their strike operations depending on changes in Russian defences, availability of missiles and drones, the provision of intelligence from the West, and the effects of previous strikes. As they have demonstrated in other aspects of this war, the Ukrainians will be learning and adapting to improve their own strike capabilities, as well as using this knowledge to anticipate and defeat Russian strikes against Ukrainian targets. The development, operations and evolution of the Ukrainian and Russian strike complexes will be one of the key adaptation battles of this war in 2024. And I guess there's an interesting conversation to be had in comparing the successes of the Russian strike strategy compared to the Ukrainian one, where the Russians, I don't think, have been effective over the course of the war. They might, I think, possibly being more effective of late in striking. So at the beginning of the war, there was a lot of concentration on trying to break, I think, the spirit of the Ukrainians by taking out civilian infrastructure. Then they moved on to energy infrastructure, and that broadly didn't work so much in the winter of 22 into 23. And so the winter of 23 into 24, they moved away from striking the energy infrastructure. And in fact, the Ukrainians got away with having a winter that didn't have their heating and energy too badly affected. But they've moved more towards striking at the industrial military complex, because now 2 years into the war, the Ukrainians have built up what looks to be a very meaningful industrial military complex that is looking to be far more dynamic than the Russian counterpart. It is seeing investment from abroad. They are creating new manufacturing facilities, predominantly in the west of Ukraine. And so this is a real threat to the success of the Russians long term in this war. So the Russians have moved from hitting the energy infrastructure to hitting directly the defense military industrial complex. And then more recently still, after the winter, they've moved back towards hitting energy infrastructure again, but not, I don't think, in terms of trying to break the spirit of the Ukrainians and making sure that the civilians are having a tough time of it in terms of heating and electricity, and the commercial world is affected as well. That's all a kind of collateral bonus for the Russians, I guess. But what they're trying to do is stop the military industrial complex from operating, from getting the power to make the machinery. So the question is, has the Russian strategy been successful? And I would say broadly not. So in 2 years of war, I think we've got to a point where the Russians are firing missiles and drones at the rate they can manufacture and procure them, which means that they've actually, I think, wasted a lot of missiles and a lot of drones as well in ineffectively attacking the Ukrainians. They used at the beginning of the war outdated maps as intelligence. They didn't have good satellite imagery. They didn't have a good mechanism or process for taking out time-sensitive targets. All sorts of challenges the Russians have had, but they have been adapting throughout the course of the war, and I think are more effective. I think, for example, Lancets are particularly effective, and they have been a real nuisance throughout the course of the war. They're quite variable, admittedly, but they've had enough of them to really cause a problem for the Ukrainians, and they're still able to hit targets, particularly in the southwest at the moment, that are far enough behind the front line, but actually close enough to really significant target areas like Mykolaiv as a city that you would expect a Lancet to not get as far as that and to be taken down by air defenses and electronic warfare. And yet there they are hitting patrol ships and whatnot on the Bug River, and you're thinking, and radar installations and so on and so forth, hitting some pretty high value targets with things like Lancet. So there are elements where the Russians have done really well. There are elements of adaptation through the course of the war, but I think on balance they have been wasteful with their missiles and their drones. And I think the Ukrainians have been very much the opposite, where they've started off from a position of not having the capacity of missiles and drones. They've had to develop that over the course of the war, and they're getting to a point now where they can use their own indigenous missiles and drones to fire into Russia, where Western nations providing equipment have disallowed the Ukrainians to use Western equipment into Russia, so they're having to develop their own stuff. But they are targeting their objectives are far more, well, military for a start. I think that they have shown themselves to hit factories much more consistently than the Russians have. If you look at the Russians over the course of the war, as mentioned, too much concentration on civilian infrastructure, not enough on military targets. And the Ukrainians have been the opposite there. So I think they've been very good with what they've had to work with, which is not a lot. So you're starting to get to a point where the Ukrainians have more drones to use, and hopefully at some point soon more missiles to use, and you will see them compete in terms of the size of the barrages that they send into Russia compared to what Russia sends into Ukraine. And hitting things like oil refineries recently has been very strategic and very successful. So I just think on balance, the Ukrainians, with what they've got, have done a better job. But of course, as with battles on the front line, the Russians get their success by just sheer mass. And so over 2 years of firing missiles, and you count the number of missiles and drones they've fired in, and they have had success, of course, with that. But does the success match the mass of what they've done in the same way that it's just kind of the same principle, isn't it? Does the amount of land they've taken in the last year and a half match the amount of personnel and equipment that they have lost in so doing? Does the amount of success they've had with missiles and drones match the amount of missiles and drones that they have used? And I would say not, although they have had success because of that mass. The Ukrainians have done more with less. But of course, you can do more with less until the cows come home, because if your less is nowhere near what the other side is able to do, they can be wasteful. They can only have 10% success rate, but fire like 1 million missiles and drones. And you can have 90% success rate, but if you're only firing a couple of hundred, then, I'm making these numbers up, but you get the point there. So I think the Ukrainians have been better with their missiles, but they're still struggling in terms of the number of missiles and drones they are firing. And I wonder whether that's going to change going forward. Right, we're going to go on to more divisive stuff, I guess. We're going to do a Vacnick soup talking about David Sachs. Now, who is David Sachs? And the reason I'm picking on him is because I think he's a deeply important person internationally. He's an absolute scumbag, in my opinion. That's my concerted analyst's opinion. He's a scumbag. And he is Elon Musk's best mate, pretty much. And Musk retweets this guy far too often for my liking. And this guy, if you just look on his Twitter profile at the moment, and I'll explain why he's so important in a minute, but just look at the sorts of thing he's saying. So this is all recent stuff. This is literally 2 hours ago. Of course, talking about Biden here, but really going into the ISIS attack in Moscow. And he is basically blaming Ukraine and saying that Ukraine are lying and the US are lying. If the Ukrainian government was behind a terrorist attack, as looks increasingly likely, it's the opposite. It doesn't look increasingly likely. It looks less and less likely that Ukraine was behind it. The US must renounce it, else we become complicit. The US would never forgive a terrorist attack like this, and neither will the Russians. Obviously, it's too early to say for sure, which is why my post begins with the if. Yeah, but it's like just asking questions. I'm just asking questions, so, I'm going to say something which is just a question, but it actually makes me really, if you're looking under the surface, I am just a Nazi or something like that. Is a kind of just asking questions approach, and this is what he's doing. Well, if this is the case, he's basically saying this is the case and this is what should happen. So obviously it's too early to say for sure, but David T. Pine provides substantial evidence for why Ukrainian intelligence could be involved in the terror attack. His article here with updated screenshot. And of course, he wants to throw in that big screenshot because terrorist attack that killed 143 Russian civilians in Moscow yesterday appears to have been sponsored by Ukraine, not ISIS-K. And this is a guy that's just spreading this stuff. And then every other tweet is either attacking like woke mindset or it's attacking Ukraine. And that's all he does. Like pro-Ukraine accounts are becoming hysterical over this post and this is what else. And then the pro-Ukraine side is simultaneously arguing, blah, blah, blah. It's just like, and then put it in my ears, and in my ears when I listen to people like this speak, or smearing my eyes with just bile. Anyway, enough of those extended metaphors. So I'm not a big fan of David Sachs, as you can tell, but he is important because he has huge reach. Yes, he's got almost 1 million followers on Twitter, and in other places he's got his own Substack, but it's the fact that his best mate is Elon Musk, who has tremendous reach, is amplified on the platform every time I turn Twitter on. If I'm looking at the It probably won't do it now, but if I go to home and look at For You, I've just been already looking at this, but if I turn my computer on and turn on Twitter, almost invariably one of the first posts here will be an Elon Musk post, because he has the code written so that his own voice is amplified on his own platform. Apparently because this first came about because he was really upset that Joe Biden had more views than he did on one of his tweets about something in particular. He's like, right, I want to amplify my own voice because, free speech. So anyway, he amplifies people like David Sachs, whom he respects a lot, and therefore Musk is amplifying anti-Ukrainian rhetoric so often, and it's just deeply, deeply irresponsible. And this is why I am not a fan of Elon Musk, because he's morally wrong, just as David Sachs is morally wrong. Politically wrong, morally wrong. Politics is just a subset of morality, right? Just morality writ large. So anyway, Pekka Kallioniemi, who does Vatnik Soup, back in April last year, did this on David Sachs. So I just want to give you some info about who he is. So I'll introduce an American entrepreneur and investor, David Sachs. He's best known for his investment in various tech firms, for his Ghost Town podcast service, Kalin, and for his peace plan on the Russia-Ukrainian war. Peace plan in scare quotes. David is much better as a businessman than as a political commentator. He's been involved in many successful companies such as PayPal, Yammer, and Jenny.com, and as an angel investor in Airbnb, Facebook, and Uber. In 1995, while in college, Sachs and his pal Peter Thiel published a book called The Diversity Myth, Multiculturalism and the Politics of Intolerance at Stanford. The book was critical of culture of political correctness in the universities, arguing that campuses should have more intellectual diversity. Later in 2016, David apologized for sections of the book where he called date rape belated regret, questioning why is all blame placed on the man. 3 years prior, they published an article entitled The Rape Issue, defending a student who had earlier pleaded no contest, meaning that the defendant does not accept or deny responsibility for the charges but agrees to accept punishment on statutory rape case. Sachs allegedly included a graphic description of said encounter, suggesting that the 17-year-old victim still had the physical coordination to perform oral sex and therefore could have uttered the word no. Sachs launched a social podcasting site, Kalin, in 2021. Its current top shows are hosted by, let's see who they are, Brianna Joy Gray, Aaron Mate, Katie, my password is 1234 helper, and Michael Tracy. The site itself seems to be a ghost town, with the biggest shows attracting only 3,000 to 7,000 subscribers. I'm sure that David has had many enlightening discussions with these people who all for some reason seem to support a genocidal maniac, some even several. The problem with Sachs's commentary on the war in Ukraine is that he's completely clueless about its history, and especially on the history of Russian imperialism and meddling with its neighbouring countries. But what about the US CIA meddling in Iraq, Central America, etc.? It's a different conversation. It also includes some conspiratorial ideas of deep state affecting everything and anything related to US foreign policy, which we saw back here, which is the idea that the US is involved with ISIS doing the things that they did in Moscow. Anyway, his international investor friend told that the corruption in Ukraine is beyond belief. So I'm just just seeing whether I've missed anything here. Beyond belief. Again, he has problems in understanding that the systematic corruption is mostly a result of the previous Soviet system and of the Russian meddling since Ukraine's independence in 1991. I think this is a really important point, by the way, as a bit of a sidebar. And I talked about this with Tom when we were looking at Russell Brand's nonsense about Ukraine. It was getting wrong. And the idea of Ukraine does have corruption, and it is trying to deal very strongly with corruption whilst being invaded by another country, I might add. So it's quite impressive what they're doing. But they have to do that in order to jump through these anti-corruption hoops in order to accede to the EU and to NATO and to get money from the IMF and all sorts of things. So there is the moral dimension and there is the existential dimension. So they need to do it in order to survive, in order to have these great goals for their future, but also it's the right thing to do too. And you get this constant criticism that they are corrupt, and of course there is corruption there, but that is itself a legacy of the Soviet era. I mean, when you look at Russia, the Russian Federation, and you see them tumbling down the Transparency International Corruption Index, and Ukraine is moving in the right direction, you get an understanding that, and I'm not trying to do whataboutery, but when it's Russia that's behind the amplification of these claims that Ukraine is corrupt, then there is a massive deal of hypocrisy going on there. When you look at the things that Ukraine is trying desperately to do, then it's admirable, given, as I mentioned, that it's taking place in the middle of a war where they're being invaded. And yeah, so people like David Sachs absolutely shouting about corruption, so on and so forth. I was talking to an international investor who says the corruption in Ukraine is beyond belief. Theft and bribery are endemic, so on and so forth. It's like, the old speaking to a mate. But, fair enough, and someone could believe that. There are many people who do believe that, but it's about the trajectory of the course they are on. It's about where they've come from and why they have come from there, why they were there and why they are where they are now. It's because they've rejected that Soviet mindset in moving towards a Western, more transparent culture. And that's not to say the West is fully perfect. There's corruption all over the place, and some of it's legalized corruption, like lobbying, etc., etc. Interestingly, Ukraine have been working hard to get anti-lobbying or transparency rules to do with lobbying that's been requested by the EU. So that's good news there. In his article, Should America go all in on Ukraine? For the American conservative, Sachs warned about Russia's nuclear threat and compared foreign politics to a game of poker, stating that pro-Ukraine commentators have not conducted a cost-benefit analysis or even played a hand of high-stakes poker. David's reasoning in the article is as follows. The more that Ukraine and the West weaken Russia, the higher the risk that Putin will resort to unconventional arms, which is interestingly a perfectly valid observation, because that's what I call the Putin paradox. The better Ukraine do, the more likely Putin is to do something mental, because Putin is coming towards the end of his life. I don't think his health is good, and I think he's not going to last a lot longer. But he's also a dictator, and dictators generally don't retire to sit by the pool for the rest of their lives. They either die or they end up in prison, and so he's going to do anything to stay in power and to keep his legacy as positive in terms of Russian imperialism, I guess, as he can. And so he will do pretty nuts things. Now, just because someone's going to do nuts things, it doesn't mean you should let them do nuts things, though, or you should you should not try and stop them just in case they're going to do nuts things. It's like, psychopath comes in and says, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and you can either, for your own, I guess, self-preservation, say, yeah, okay, go for it, mate. You go and kill some people over there, and that's going to keep yourself alive more. So lucky that person, I've let that person go and do some terrible things. Or you can stand up with the moral backbone and say, no, mate, I'm not going to let you go and do some terrible psychopathic things over there to those people, and I'm going to try and stop you. And it may end up in you getting damaged or injured or killed or whatever, but you're standing up and doing the right moral thing. And are we going to stand up and do the right moral thing against the psychopathy of Russia? Or are we just going to let them go and psychopathically, genocidally invade another nation? And yes, if we do try and stop them, and if Ukraine tries and stop them and does increasingly well, are they going to have a greater chance of pressing the nuclear button? Yes. But I think, given they're a nuclear nation, we can't just let that rationale dictate everything, because otherwise we would let them take over the entire world. Yeah, but they might press a nuclear button. Okay, so we'll let them take Ukraine. And now they've invaded Poland. Yeah, but they might press a nuclear button. Okay, we'll let them invade Poland. They've gone to Germany. Germany don't have nuclear weapons, do they? No, it's only Britain and France in Europe, isn't it? Okay. we shouldn't do anything because they might press the nuclear button. Okay, let them take Germany. And then before you know it, the entire world, apart from nuclear nations, have been overtaken by Russia. And of course, we're not going to let that happen, but that is that rationale. Anyway, as Pekka says, basically saying that we shouldn't do anything to a genocidal maniac because they might just nuke us. I'm sure that people of Chechnya, Moldova, Georgia, Syria and Ukraine agree with this statement. Sachs also suggests that the US could offer a peace deal with Ukraine. So, yeah, sure. Become neutral and there would be a referendum in Donbass and Crimea to determine their fate. A week later, Elon Musk parroted this Sachs's call for peace on Twitter. The only problem is that when becoming independent in 1991, both of these areas already voted to be part of Ukraine. And just to kind of head off these, and this is when I reported on this, when Elon Musk was spouting this stuff and using outdated polls as well in further tweets he was making. But this is also an issue because the way that Russia has manipulated the populations of the Donbass and Crimea by bringing in indigenous Russians to almost, if you're worried about the great replacement theory, that's pretty much what Russia have done to occupied territories of Ukraine and then force them to give up their Ukrainian passports and take on Russian passports in order to get welfare and so on and so forth. So then you get to this position several years down the line where you have basically eliminated or deported or whatever the existing Ukrainian population, and then you've got basically indigenous Russians then living there and saying, right, let's have a referendum as to who you guys want to be ruled by, and everyone votes for Russia. Of course, that's going to happen. And what you need to do is get to a situation where no, that Russia aren't there. We allow the people who do live there, whose houses, who've built their houses in Zaporizhia and Kherson and Crimea and the Donbass. You get those people back in. You say, and now, who would you like to be ruling over you? Would you like to be a self-determining nation, independent nation? Or would you like to be ruled by Russia? And then we'll see what they think then. Anyway, David Sachs is still fighting the battle against woke mind virus. This is something that Elon Musk is entirely obsessed with. The same battle he started already in 1992 with his good friend Peter Thiel. In a recent interview with Unheard, he said that woke cancellation tactics are used to silence any peace negotiations and that the whole thing is turning into woke war 3. I mean, like I've said to you before, and you might call me a lefty, liberal, wishy-washy, woke, whatever, but I can tell you this. In modern politics, if someone is trying to sell you the mind virus of wokeism, right, and that woke is taking over society, what they are doing is getting you to concentrate on the wrong thing. It's a magician's sleight of hand. It's like, oh, everything's woke. Oh, cancel culture. Oh, it's a war on Christmas. It's this, it's that, it's this. And getting you to get so angry about this froth that's here, this stuff that's just not super, super important. Getting you to focus on that. And meanwhile, there's a frickin' world war going on over there, or there's an economic collapse going on there. We're not talking about that. I'm not giving you any policy here. I'm not providing you with any meaningful political solutions to like big issues. I'm going to get you angry about woke. And if you're getting angry about woke, then we can excuse all this other stuff going on over here. And it's just, it just means they're devoid of any real solutions to real big problems in the world. It's a diversion. Wokeism is a diversion, and don't get sold by it. And I know there are loads of people on my threads who are obsessed with wokeism as well, because it comes up very often and I kind of ignore it. But it's just like, it's not that important. Like, how many times has a trans toilet affected your actual life? Like, really? Like, honestly, really? Who gives a shit? Like, there are bigger things to worry about. This is just froth. Yes, you know, if you're trans, it's a big thing, and you know, if that's what you're obsessed with, I guess that's a big thing for you. But should you be obsessed by that, or should you be obsessed with the impending doom of the geopolitical global security in the world due to Russia and China getting together to wreak havoc? or or the economy and jobs, or wealth, the welfare state. And that's the kind of stuff, Medicaid and Medicare and challenges to those, and the ability for people to be in the US to be properly insured for healthcare. Or over here, are we investing enough in healthcare when we compare the investment per capita in the UK is at something like $8,000 per capita, whereas in the US, which is a private system that has insurance, covering people, and they're spending $13,000 as a government per capita. So a private system is spending almost double what we're spending in the UK, and we've got a single payer national healthcare service which is straining under the pressure. Why is it straining? Because we haven't fricking invested in it. So stop getting annoyed about bloody trans toilets and start shouting about getting more investment into our health service, or sorting out your health service in the US so you don't have millions of people uninsured and even more people underinsured, right? So it's not that you don't have insurance, it's that you're never going to use it because it's crap insurance and you're afraid to go to the doctor because it's going to cost you money. We don't have that problem in the UK. Do you know what? I watch a lot of, and you'll laugh at this, a lot of YouTube channels where it's like Americans living in the UK saying the 10 things I like about the UK, or 10 things I don't like about the UK, or 100 things. And I watched another one recently. It was like 101 things that I love about the UK. And always in there is stuff like, I can just go to the doctors when I'm feeling a bit ill. And okay, there might be a bit of a wait to get an appointment, but it's like, it's free. I don't have to think about paying money or claiming on insurance and stuff. It's like, I'm ill, I'm going to book a doctor's appointment. I get a triage appointment with a nurse. I don't have to think about whether I can pay for that or not. But anyway, these are but the point is that those are real issues that we need to be thinking about, not bloody war on Christmas crap. But when you have someone like this who is, and Elon Musk, if you look at all of Elon Musk's latest tweets, they're all about either anti-Ukraine, or they're mainly anti-Ukraine, or woke mind viruses going mental. And it's just like, you're a billionaire, the most powerful man in the world. You could do so much more good by getting people to worry about really big issues that mean, like, if Elon Musk did a 180 switch to being pro-Ukraine and took his followers with him on that, think of the benefit that would give to the world. Think of the benefit that would give for people putting pressure on their parliamentarians, on their lawmakers in the US, to do stuff in favour of Ukraine. If Elon Musk was really strong on Ukraine and not pissing about with woke mind virus stuff, the difference he could make would be incredible. But he doesn't, and it's diversion and it's nonsense. So Sachs is still fighting that same old battle there. And talking about, turning into woke war 3. But Putin himself has said that the 4 annexed regions are part of Russian Federation, and they're not willing to negotiate about this. The way we can have real peace negotiations is after Russia, pardon my French, F's off from all regions of Ukraine, including Crimea. Sachs has brought up the conspiratorial idea that Victoria Nuland ousting Ukraine's democratically elected government and that she was instigating the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, again having no knowledge of the history of either Russia or Ukraine. He's also claimed that the Donbass has been the location of a civil war for 8 years, completely disregarding the overwhelming evidence that Russia fabricated and coordinated most of it, and also sending in military forces. It's just total naivety, just a bastardization of politics and history and conspiratorial thinking as well. It just irritates the bejesus out of me that people in positions of power, and power in terms of controlling the narrative, in this case on social media, are people who are deeply ignorant and prone to conspiracy theorizing. So depressing. We know all this because of the Glaziev tapes, the Surkov leaks, and the intercepted calls of Konstantin Malofeyev. It was also directly stated by former FSB officer Igor Girkin, who shot down MH17. In other words, all the nonsense about little green men and the fact that Russia is all behind that. He's also suggested that it was Ukraine that broke the Minsk II agreement, which to some degree is correct, but so did Russia. Russia also broke the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where they promised to respect the signatories' countries' independence and sovereignty in the existing borders, and, quote, refrain from the threat or the use of force against the signatory. A month ago, David, so this is back in 2023 obviously, David was prematurely touting about the fall of Bakhmut and blamed media for portraying Russian defeat as inevitable. The war, of course, is far from over, but Russia has been trying to take a small and strategy-wise pointless town since the beginning of August 2022. I would hardly call that success. To conclude, for some reason, perhaps due to his success in business, Sachs thinks that he has the answer to this complex and horrible conflict. He has no knowledge on the history of these two countries. He doesn't know the background of the conflict. He doesn't account either side's agency, nor does he think about any long-term implications. By the way, David, have you ever heard of the Second Chechen War? And there you go, another great thread there from Pekka Kallioniemi to give you a sense of who David Sachs is and why we should ignore him. But it's so difficult to ignore him when his opinions are being amplified across the world to the point that they do genuinely influence people. And it's not only will it be amplified by Russian trolls and their troll farms, but by Elon Musk, the world's biggest megaphone. Really is that way. Okay, is that enough from me? Probably is. I've got a really big Chris Wiki thread here about Viktor Orban and Trump that I meant to share with you a week or so ago. Oh my goodness! I'll try and rush through this. So Viktor Orban has disclosed that what he says is Donald Trump's plan for ending the war in Ukraine by cutting off all American aid, as Trump has at least a 50-50 chance of becoming the next US president. This has to be taken seriously. Could Trump's plan actually work? There's good reason to believe that it wouldn't, and could not only make the war much worse, particularly for the Ukrainians, but would also damage Trump and could also force European powers to intervene directly, turning the war into an over EU-Russia fight. And here's why. Let's think about what Ukraine needs from its allies: military equipment, ammunition, air defences and financial aid. Europe has provided a lot, but the US support has undoubtedly made the difference between survival and so far at least, and defeat. What happens if that support is cut off abruptly? A number of short and medium term things. So first, Putin would redouble his offensive in Ukraine and will have even less interest in negotiating. He has already made this clear, and he refers to Putin actually saying such. Next, Ukraine won't stop fighting because it can't afford to. The more territory it loses, the less viable it becomes as a country, and the less defensible the remainder becomes. It can't also abandon its population to Russian torture, repression and expulsion. This is a really, really important point, by the way, from Chris Wiki. That the more territory Ukraine loses, the more difficult it is for it to exist as an independent nation. So if it loses the land from Kherson to Transnistria, then it loses Odessa and it loses its entire coastline, and it can't export grain effectively through the Black Sea. It loses its trade from Odessa. It loses one of its biggest cities. So therefore that affects it economically massively, and then it's losing farmland, and then it loses the ability to trade that produce, and it loses people, taxpayers, businesses, as more and more land gets taken, and that's a real challenge for Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine will still be getting support from the EU and others, but possibly not enough to hold back the Russians fully. The front lines would be pushed back to the west and north, but not in a linear fashion. There's a real risk of localized collapse and breakthrough. Many Ukrainian long-range air defenses will run out, making it much more likely that missiles and perhaps even Russian Air Force bombers will be able to attack Ukrainian cities, though European supplied air defense artillery will still be available against drones. Without US financial aid, there's a risk that the Ukrainian economy will collapse, making continuing the war unaffordable for Ukraine, though I would expect that the EU would seek to fill in the gap. This is perhaps a lesser risk, and that's indeed what's going on at the moment to some degree. Importantly, despite Trump's pretensions to end the war in a day, this process would go on for months. Trump seems to think that Ukraine is only able and willing to fight because of US support, like the former Afghan government. That belief is absolutely not the case. There's a really good point that he would make it end in a day, but there's every chance that Ukraine would just say, jog on, mate. We're not ending in a day. We're fighting for our very existence, and we're not going to give up all this stuff that you would want us to give up to Russia and have the negotiations play completely in Russia's favour. So, it's assuming that Ukraine have no agency in this, which is the problem. Is so much thinking to do with the geopolitical strategizing of how the war started and how the war will end is always to ignore Ukraine. It's like, oh, it's Victoria Nuland and the CIA and McCain and the Americans and the IMF and the EU that did this, and NATO encroaching. That's what did it. Or it's Russia what did it, and blah, 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 rather than like, do you know, Ukraine are involved in this as well, and they have a place to play. And do you know what? They have a part to play, and they are also wanting to be independent here, and they don't want Russia to invade them. So let's think about what they want. The optics of this would be terrible for Trump. TV screens would be filled with pictures for months on end of Ukrainian cities being destroyed for a lack of US air defense systems. That's a really interesting point as well. So if he did allow or not support Ukraine, then it would be a tough sell to say that that's a good thing the US did. Ukrainian territory being lost and triumphant Russian declarations of imminent victory. Ukraine is not Afghanistan. Its government and cause have popular legitimacy and ongoing foreign military aid on a large scale. Its people know what's at stake. US abandonment would extend the war into areas of the country that have so far been unaffected. As President Macron of France has publicly acknowledged, Ukraine's defeat would be catastrophic for the whole continent. In the worst case scenario, the Russian army would stand on the Polish and Romanian borders once again, with Russia seizing control of Ukraine's resources. Macron has mooted the possibility of the French army going to Odessa to deter the Russian moves in that direction. If things were going that badly, I would expect the Poles and perhaps other European nations to make a similar move to protect Kiev. I find it really interesting that Macron keeps talking about Odessa, and that's his red line, because he recognises the importance of Odessa and that whole coastline. And if Ukraine lose that, then they really are scuppered. In such a scenario, there's an obvious danger of a direct conflict between European forces and Putin's armies, but this brings us to the most important point of all. What does Putin actually want? In reality, this isn't a secret. He's been open about this. As well as replacing Ukraine's government with a pro-Russian one, he wants Ukraine to surrender the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, including the parts not under Russian control, which includes the Ukrainian-held cities of Kherson and Zaporizhia. There's no reason to believe that the end of his territorial ambitions, that this will be, Russia's former president and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev has presented a frankly delusional map showing Russia controlling most of Ukraine, with Poland, Hungary and Romania getting the rest. This is literally what Medvedev shared the other day in a big speech to Russians, and it was that Ukraine get to keep a tiny bit of Ukraine, the rest of it's given to Poland or Romania, and it's just incredible. And I think possibly even maybe some of, no, I don't think that is Belarus getting any, but yeah, it's just crazy. And then Russia obviously getting all the rest, and yeah, a little bit in Hungary getting some too. Yes, so I don't take this particularly seriously. Ukraine's western neighbours aren't going to dismember it. I do take far more seriously a map leaked in January 2023 showing 8 Ukrainian regions plus Crimea being annexed to Russia. And I think, yeah, that's much more likely. This was part of an industrial plan drawn up. And by the way, this is a really interesting look into actual plans that were leaked concerning what Russia has in store industrially for Ukraine if they basically stole a bunch of their regions. Really fascinating stuff. And it's actually laid out quite explicitly. This was part of an industrial plan drawn up by the oligarch Konstantin Malofeyev, who is very much a part of Putin's inner circle, a chap that we've heard from in Pekka Kalyanami's thread. It essentially shows that all the key industrial areas and ports of Ukraine being annexed, leaving the agricultural heartlands landlocked. Ukraine is a big country, twice the size of France or nearly the size of Texas, and with a pre-war population of nearly 44 million people, it was never realistic for Russia to seek to conquer the entire country given the difficulty in controlling such a large area. So that's pretty much how big Ukraine is in terms of the US. It's unclear how official Malofiev's map is, but given his connections, I think it's fairly likely to be well informed by the Kremlin's ideas. It would make sense for Russia to focus on annexing areas adjacent to its own borders and creating a corridor to Transnistria. I suspect that Macron is thinking along similar lines, which is why it was particularly interesting that he focused on protecting Odessa. It's a clear indication that he considers any Russian moves towards Moldova to be a red line. I think that Russia's forced a retreat from the right bank of the Dnipro in November 2022 and the destruction of all the river crossings will make it unlikely that it can move on Kherson City and Odessa. However, I wouldn't rule out an attempt to move further up the left bank. In the early days of the war, some suggested that Putin aimed to seize the whole of the left bank Ukraine, i.e. the regions of Dnipropetrovsk, Poltava, Chernihiv, Sumy and part of Kyiv, in addition to the existing occupied part or annexed regions, but there are good reasons not to. Apart from Dnipropetrovsk, the northeastern regions are less economically valuable than the industrial heartlands in the southeast. As Russia's failed invasion of the northeast showed in 2022, it's also a very big area to take and hold down. Overstretch is a real risk. Malofiev's map of the Russian occupation zone therefore may represent what the Kremlin sees as a viable middle ground, all the most economically and strategically valuable regions, and Russia has the capacity to seize and annex. Putin was committed or has committed himself to seizing the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Luhansk is almost entirely under Russian control, as is about half of Donetsk. I think this has to represent at least a minimum objective for his war goals for the next year. Russia still controls a sliver of the Kharkiv region and is continuing to press the Ukrainian lines from the west. The terrain and rivers make it a difficult area to fight over, so any Russian gains would likely be slow and costly to achieve under any scenario. Trump's plan would undoubtedly degrade Ukraine's ability to resist the Russian advance, but clearly wouldn't end the war. It is possible that he would attempt to cause a Ukrainian collapse by pressuring other countries to also end military aid. This may result in Europe facing a choice between caving to the demands of the de facto Trump-Putin alliance or continuing to support Ukraine. One problem with many European countries adopting US military equipment is that it provides a Trumpian US with a means of leverage. European states would in any case face fresh waves of refugees from a further Russian advance, and the now explicit threat of Russia conscripting occupied Ukrainians into its army to support further offensives. That threat becomes existential for some countries, like Poland. So in summary, Trump's plan would likely result in the war's intensification, a slow Ukrainian retreat over the course of months, a risk of localized Ukrainian collapses, many more refugees, and an increasing risk of European countries having to intervene directly. Reality is that a Trump solution to this, or not paying a penny, either not doing anything for Ukraine and kind of abandoning it, or trying to force it to the table to accept a negotiation which it wouldn't accept, would lead to those outcomes. I think that's an interesting analysis. Let me know what you think. Anyway, that's enough from me. I've spoken for far too long. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.